In 1084 AD, on the holiest day of the Christian calendar, two armies clashed in the frozen foothills of the Pyrenees in a battle that would shatter a kingdom's dreams and prove that even Christmas Day offered no sanctuary from the brutality of war, and our silver-armored good knight stood in the Aragonese ranks as King Sancho Ramírez led 12,000 men into the killing ground near Naval, where the Taifa of Zaragoza waited to teach the Christian North that conquest was not inevitable. This wasn't just another border skirmish in the endless dance of the Reconquista. This was the culmination of a year-long campaign that had seen fortresses fall and kings humbled, a desperate counterstroke by a Muslim kingdom fighting for survival against the encroaching tide of Christian expansion. Watch as the rugged terrain of the Cinca River Valley becomes a graveyard for Aragonese ambition, as the tactical genius of mercenary commanders turns heavy cavalry into trapped prey, and as our immortal knight witnesses the precise moment when a decade of potential conquest evaporated in a single winter afternoon. From the treacherous ambush at Rueda that had already bloodied Alfonso VI of Leon, to the shocking reversal that would see the newly conquered fortress of Naval returned to Muslim hands, every moment of this epic tale reveals the fragility of medieval power and the thin line between triumph and disaster. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to the frozen roads and desperate battles of the 11th century, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten battle of the Reconquista you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that bitter Christmas day in 1084 when Aragon learned that God does not always favor the faithful. Chapter 1. The Silver Knight and the Weight of Winter. The good knight had seen many winters in his long, impossible life, but the winter of 1084 carried a particular weight, a heaviness that settled not just in the frozen mud of the mountain roads, but in the very air itself, thick with the promise of violence and the metallic taste of coming snow. He rode near the center of the Aragonese column, his silver armor catching what little light filtered through the gray December sky. The armor was old, older than any man in this army could comprehend, yet it gleamed as if freshly polished, each plate and rivet a testament to craftsmanship from an age whose name had been forgotten by all but him. Beneath the armor, he wore a padded gambeson that did little to keep out the cold that seeped through the gaps in his protection, settling into his bones with the familiar ache of countless campaigns. Around him, the army of King Sancho Ramírez stretched along the narrow road like a steel serpent winding through the pre-Pyrenean foothills. The column was perhaps 2,000 strong, a formidable force by the standards of the age, though the good knight had marched with armies 10 times this size in centuries past. The core of the force was the milites, the heavy cavalry of the Aragonese nobility, men encased in chainmail hauberks that hung to their knees, their heads protected by conical helmets with nasal guards that gave them the appearance of iron-faced birds of prey. These were proud men, the sons of the mountain valleys and the high plateaus, men who had spent the year of 1084 tasting victory. They had taken Graus in the spring, that fortress whose walls had drunk the blood of King Ramiro IV 21 years before. They had pushed south through the summer, seizing the strategic town of Naval with its salt mines and pottery kilns, its Roman road and its commanding view of the Cinca River Valley. They had, in their minds, proven that the Taifa of Zaragoza, that wealthy, sophisticated Muslim kingdom that had dominated the Ebro frontier for generations, was finally vulnerable, finally ready to fall. The good knight knew better. He had learned, across the centuries, to read the signs that other men missed. He saw them now in the nervous way the horses tossed their heads, in the silence of the birds in the scrubland, in the too perfect stillness of the ravines that flanked the road. He saw them in the face of King Sancho Ramírez himself, riding at the head of the column with his son Peter beside him. A face that tried to project confidence, but could not quite hide the tightness around the eyes, the way the king's gaze kept darting to the heights above them. They were marching on Christmas Day. This alone should have been a warning. The truce of God, that sacred compact that was supposed to halt warfare during holy seasons, should have protected them. But the truce of God was a Christian invention, and the army they faced, the army of the Taifa of Zaragoza, bolstered by the tactical genius of Christian mercenaries fighting for Muslim gold, did not consider itself bound by such niceties. The road they travelled was ancient, laid down by Roman engineers 1,000 years before, when this land had been the province of Hispania. Tarraconensis, and the legions had marched these same stones on their way to garrison duty in the mountains. The Romans were gone now, their empire a ghost, but their roads remained, straight where the terrain allowed, winding where the mountains demanded, always seeking the path of least resistance through the landscape. This particular stretch of road ran south from Naval toward the town of El Grado, following the western bank of the Cinca River through a landscape of transition. To the north lay the true Pyrenees, snow-capped and impassable in winter. To the south lay the Somontano, the beneath-the-mountain country, where the foothills gave way to the fertile plains of the Ebro Valley. Here, in between, the land was broken and difficult, a maze of ravines and ridges covered in scrub oak and juniper, with outcroppings of grey limestone that jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient buried giant. It was perfect ambush country. The GoodKnight's horse, a sturdy mountain breed, grey as winter itself, picked its way carefully along the rutted road. The column had been marching since dawn, and it was now past midday, though the sun was invisible behind the thick overcast. They had perhaps another hour of daylight, maybe 2 if they were lucky, before the early winter darkness would force them to make camp. The plan, as the GoodKnight understood it, was to reach a defensible position near a landmark known as Piedra Pisada, the stepped stone, or trampled stone, a distinctive rock formation that marked the boundary between the territories recently conquered by Aragon and those still held by Zaragoza. There, they would establish a fortified camp and wait for supply wagons coming up from Jaca, the Aragonese capital in the high mountains to the north. It was a sound plan, in theory. In practice, the GoodKnight suspected they would never reach Piedra Pisada. Not intact, anyway. He glanced to his left, where a young knight rode with the eager, barely contained energy of a man who had never seen real combat. The knight's name was Fortune, and he was perhaps 20 years old, the third son of a minor lord from the valley of Anso. His armor was new, the chainmail still bright and unscratched, his shield painted with his family's device, a red cross on a white field. He had been talking almost non-stop since they had left Naval that morning, his voice carrying that particular quality of forced cheerfulness that men adopt when they are trying to convince themselves they are not afraid. "They say the Moors are cowards," Fortune was saying to another young knight riding beside him. "They say they won't stand and fight like Christian men, that they rely on tricks and ambushes because they lack the courage for honest battle." The other knight, a slightly older man named Garcia, nodded agreement. "My father fought them at Grouse. He said they broke and ran the moment our charge hit their line, said it was like scattering sheep." The GoodKnight said nothing, but he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling he always got when he heard young men speak with such confidence about matters they did not understand. He had fought the Muslims of Al-Andalus before, in other campaigns, other lifetimes. He knew they were not cowards. He knew their light. Cavalry, the jinetes, could ride circles around the heavy Frankish knights, peppering them with javelins and arrows, drawing them into traps, exhausting them before the final devastating counterattack. He knew their infantry, when properly led, could form shield walls as solid as any Christian formation. And he knew that the army they faced today was not a typical Taifa force. It was commanded, or at least heavily influenced, by Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar el Cid, the Champion, a Castilian knight who had been exiled by King Alfonso VI of Leon 2 years before and had entered the service of the Taifa of Zaragoza. The Cid had already proven his worth to his new masters. In August of this same year, he had defeated a combined force of Aragonese and Catalan troops at the Battle of Morella, capturing the Count of Barcelona and humiliating King Sancho Ramírez himself. The presence of the Cid changed everything. He understood Christian tactics because he had been trained in them, had perfected them. He knew how to counter the heavy cavalry charge, how to use terrain to negate the advantages of armor and weight. He had taken the traditional Andalusi military system, with its emphasis on mobility and harassment, and grafted onto it the discipline and shock power of the Castilian knighthood. The result was an army that could fight like Christians when it needed to, and like Muslims when that was more advantageous. It was an army that did not play by the rules that men like Fortune and Garcia assumed were universal and unchanging. The column continued its slow progress south. The road here ran along the side of a ridge, with the ground falling away steeply to the right toward the river valley below, and rising just as steeply to the left toward a series of rocky outcroppings and dense thickets of scrub. The formation was necessarily strung out, unable to deploy into the broad line that would be needed for a cavalry charge. The knights rode in a column perhaps 4 or 5 abreast, with the infantry, the peonies armed with spears and bows, interspersed among them and bringing up the rear with the supply wagons. It was a vulnerable formation, and everyone knew it, but there was no alternative. The road was the only practical route through this terrain, and to leave the road would be to flounder through the broken ground, exhausting the horses and scattering the army into isolated groups that could be picked off one by one. The good knight's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, a long, straight blade of pattern-welded steel, its hilt wrapped in leather worn smooth by centuries of use. He did not draw the weapon, not yet, but he felt its presence, its weight, its readiness. He had carried this sword, or ones very much like it, through more battles than he could count. It had drunk the blood of Saxons and Saracens, Vikings and Visigoths, Huns and Hungarians. It would drink again today. He was certain of that. The wind picked up, blowing down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and something else, something that might have been smoke, though the good knight could see no fires. The horses sensed it too, their ears flicking forward and back, their nostrils flaring. Ahead, at the front of the column, King Sancho Ramírez raised his hand, calling a halt. The order rippled back through the ranks, and the column came to a ragged stop, the knights reining in their mounts, the infantry grateful for a chance to rest their legs. The good knight remained in his saddle, his eyes scanning the heights. The king had stopped the column at a point where the road widened slightly, forming a small natural plaza where a side trail branched off to the east, climbing toward what looked like a shepherd's path. It was as good a place as any to rest, but the good knight did not like it. The heights above them were too close, the cover too thick. If he were planning an ambush, this is where he would spring it. A rider came galloping back from the vanguard, one of the king's scouts, a lean man on a fast horse. He pulled up beside King Sancho, and the good knight was close enough to hear the urgent, low-voiced conversation. "Sire, the forward scouts report movement in the hills ahead. They saw riders, light cavalry, perhaps 50 or 60, on the ridgeline near Piedra Pisada. They withdrew when our men approached, but they were there." the king finished. His voice was steady, but the good knight could hear the tension beneath it. "How far to Piedra Pisada?" "Perhaps 2 miles, sire. Maybe less. The road is good, but there are several narrow passages where the column will have to compress." King Sancho was silent for a moment, his jaw working as he considered his options. He could turn back, retreat to Naval and the safety of its walls. But that would mean abandoning the campaign, admitting defeat, losing all the gains of the past year. It would mean returning to Yaka in shame, his reputation damaged, his nobles questioning his leadership. Or he could press forward, gambling that the enemy force was small, that it was merely a scouting party, that the main Zaragozan army was still far to the south, unaware of the Aragonese position. The good knight knew which choice the king would make. He had seen this moment play out 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different wars. Pride and ambition always won out over caution, always. "We continue," King Sancho said finally. "But send word back to tighten the column. I want the knights ready to deploy at a moment's notice, and double the scouts on the flanks. If there's an ambush waiting, I want to know about it before we ride into it." The scout nodded and spurred his horse back toward the vanguard. The order to resume the march rippled through the column, and the army lurched back into motion. The good knight touched his heels to his horse's flanks, urging the animal forward. Beside him, Fortune was still talking, his voice now tinged with excitement rather than nervousness. "Did you hear? There are Moors ahead. Finally, we'll get a chance to prove ourselves in battle. I've been training for this my whole life." The good knight finally spoke, his voice quiet and measured. "Battle is not what you think it is." Fortune turned to look at him, surprised. The good knight rarely spoke, and when he did, men tended to listen. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, in the ancient quality of his armor, in the scars that were visible on his hands and neck, that commanded respect. "What do you mean?" Fortune asked. "You think it will be glorious," the good knight said. "You think it will be like the songs the minstrels sing, brave knights charging in perfect formation, banners flying, enemies falling before you like wheat before the scythe. You think you will be a hero." "Won't I?" There was a note of defensiveness in Fortune's voice now. The good knight shook his head slowly. "Battle is chaos. It is noise and confusion and terror. It is the smell of blood and shit and fear. It is watching your friends die in ways that are neither quick nor clean. It is discovering that your courage, which seemed so solid in the safety of your father's hall, is actually a fragile thing that can shatter in an instant." Fortune's face had gone pale. You're trying to frighten me." "No," the good knight said. "I'm trying to prepare you. Fear is not your enemy. Fear is what keeps you alive. The men who die first in battle are the ones who think they are invincible." Before Fortune could respond, a shout went up from the vanguard, a cry of alarm that cut through the cold air like a blade. And then the world exploded into violence. Chapter 2. The Killing Ground. The attack came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the terrain. From the heights to the left, a storm of arrows and javelins descended on the column. The good knight heard the distinctive whistle of the missiles cutting through the air, heard the meaty thunk of iron points striking flesh, and the metallic clang of shafts glancing off armor. A horse screamed, a sound of pure animal terror, and went down, thrashing, throwing its rider into the mud. From ahead, where the road narrowed as it approached a rocky defile, a line of infantry appeared, as if conjured from the earth itself. They were Zaragozan troops, a mix of Andalusi spearmen in their distinctive scale armor and North African mercenaries in flowing robes, their faces wrapped in cloth against the cold. They formed a shield wall across the road, 3 ranks deep, their spears leveled, blocking any forward progress. And from behind, cutting off the retreat, came the cavalry. The Jinetes, the light horsemen of Al-Andalus, riding their swift barb horses, each man armed with a bundle of javelins and a curved sword. They swept down from a side ravine that the Aragonese scouts had somehow missed, crashing into the rear of the column, where the infantry and supply wagons were most vulnerable. The GoodKnight's training that had been honed over centuries, took over. His conscious mind seemed to step back, and his body moved with the fluid, economical precision of long practice. He pulled his shield from where it hung on his saddle, slipping his left arm through the straps, feeling the familiar weight settle against his forearm. His right hand drew his sword in one smooth motion, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. Around him, the Aragonese column was dissolving into chaos. Knights were trying to wheel their horses, to form some kind of defensive line, but the narrow road and the press of bodies made it nearly impossible. Men were shouting, orders, warnings, prayers, their voices blending into a cacophony that made it impossible to distinguish individual words. An arrow struck the GoodKnight's shield with enough force to drive the point through the wood and leather, the iron head stopping just inches from his arm. He ignored it, his eyes scanning the battlefield, trying to make sense of the chaos, trying to find the pattern in the violence. King Sancho Ramírez was at the front of the column, trying to rally his knights for a charge against the infantry blocking the road. It was the right instinct. The only way to break out of this trap was to smash through one of the enemy formations and create an escape route. But the ground was wrong for it. The road was too narrow, the approach too constricted. The knights would have to charge in a column, unable to deploy into the broad line that would give their charge its devastating impact. The GoodKnight knew what would happen. He had seen it before. The leading knights would hit the shield wall and be stopped cold, their momentum absorbed by the mass of infantry. The knights behind would pile into them, creating a confused melee where the advantages of armor and horseflesh would be negated by the press of bodies. And all the while, the archers on the heights would continue to pour missiles into the trapped column, picking off men and horses with impunity. But there was no alternative. To stay here was to die. "Form up!" The GoodKnight's voice cut through the chaos, pitched to carry over the noise of battle. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed, and men responded to it instinctively. "Knights to the front! Infantry, shield wall to the rear! Protect the flanks!" He didn't know if anyone heard him, if anyone would follow his orders. He was not a commander in this army, not a lord or a baron. He was just another knight, distinguished only by his strange, archaic armor and his habit of surviving battles that killed other men. But men were desperate for leadership, for someone who seemed to know what to do, and the GoodKnight's calm, authoritative tone cut through their panic. Knights began to move toward the front of the column, their horses jostling for position. The infantry, those who were still alive and mobile, began to form a ragged line facing the rear, their spears and shields creating a bristling barrier against the Jinetes who were harrying the column's tail. The GoodKnight spurred his horse forward, pushing through the press of bodies toward the front where King Sancho was organizing the charge. An arrow hissed past his head, so close he felt the wind of its passage. Another struck his shoulder, the point skittering off the curved surface of his pauldron with a screech of metal on metal. He reached the front just as the king was lowering his lance, preparing to lead the charge himself. Prince Peter was beside him, his young face set in a mask of determination that couldn't quite hide his fear. Around them, perhaps 50 knights had managed to form into something resembling a formation, a wedge, with the king at its point. "Sire!" the GoodKnight called out. "The ground is wrong for a charge. We need to break through." King Sancho cut him off. His voice was tight with stress, but his eyes were clear. He knew the situation was desperate, knew that unconventional tactics were needed. If we stay here, we die. If we charge, some of us might survive. That's the only choice we have. The good knight wanted to argue, wanted to point out that there might be another way, a fighting retreat, perhaps, or an attempt to scale the heights and attack the archers. But he knew the king was right. They were out of time and out of options. "Then I ride with you," the good knight said simply. King Sancho nodded, a brief acknowledgement, and then he was spurring his horse forward, his lance leveled, his voice rising in a battle cry that was half prayer, half defiance. "Santiago! Santiago y tierra España!" It was the ancient war cry of Christian Spain. St. James, and close with Spain, invoking the patron saint of the Reconquista, the saint whose supposed appearance at the Battle of Clavijo 3 centuries before had turned the tide against the Moors. The good knight did not believe in Santiago, or in any of the saints whose names men invoked as they rode to their deaths. He had lived too long, seen too many prayers go unanswered, to put his faith in divine intervention. But he understood the power of the cry, the way it could unite men and give them courage in the face of overwhelming odds. He added his voice to the chorus, and then he was charging, his horse's hooves pounding the frozen earth, the wind of his passage whipping his cloak behind him. The distance to the enemy shield wall was perhaps 100 yards, enough space for the horses to build up speed, but not enough for them to reach the full, thundering gallop that made a cavalry charge truly devastating. The road was littered with obstacles, fallen men and horses, discarded equipment, patches of ice where water had frozen in the ruts. The good knight's horse leaped over a body, stumbled slightly on landing, recovered. The enemy infantry braced themselves, their spears angled forward, the butts planted in the ground. Behind the first rank, the good knight could see more men, archers drawing their bows, preparing to loose at point-blank range. 50 yards. The good knight shifted his grip on his sword, holding it low and to the right, ready for the overhand cut that would be his opening move. He had no lance. He had never liked the weapon, found it too specialized, too likely to break or become lodged in an enemy's body. The sword was more versatile, more reliable. 30 yards. He could see individual faces now in the enemy line. Young men, mostly, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, was praying, his lips moving silently. Another was grinning, a wild, manic expression that spoke of battle madness or perhaps just terror held barely in check. 20 yards. The archers loosed. The good knight saw the arrows coming, a dark cloud against the grey sky, and he hunched behind his shield, making himself as small a target as possible. He felt impacts. 1, 2, 3. Arrows striking his shield, his armor, his horse's barding. His horse screamed but kept running, driven forward by momentum and training and the press of other horses around it. 10 yards. King Sancho's lance struck the shield wall first, the point punching through a wooden shield and into the man behind it. The king's horse, a massive destrier bred for war, crashed into the line with the force of a battering ram. Men went down, the formation buckling. And then the good knight hit the line, and the world became a blur of violence and noise and the desperate animal struggle to survive. His sword came down in a sweeping arc, striking the rim of a shield and glancing off to bite into the shoulder of the man holding it. The man went down with a scream. The good knight's horse reared, its iron-shod hooves lashing out, crushing the skull of another infantryman. He felt a spear point scrape along his thigh, turned in the saddle, brought his sword down in a backhand cut that severed the spear shaft and opened the spearman's face from temple to jaw. The shield wall was breaking, the infantry falling back in disorder. For a moment, the good knight thought they might actually succeed, might actually break through and escape this trap. But then he saw what was waiting beyond the infantry line, and his heart sank. More cavalry. Not jinetes this time, but heavy cavalry. Christian knights in full armor, fighting for Muslim gold. Mercenaries, like the Cid himself, men who had sold their swords to the highest bidder and who fought with all the skill and ferocity of the Frankish knighthood. There were perhaps 100 of them, formed in a solid line across the road, their lances leveled, waiting. The Aragonese charge had spent its momentum breaking through the infantry. The horses were blown, the knights scattered and disorganized. They had no chance against a fresh formation of heavy cavalry. King Sancho saw it too. The good knight heard him shout, a wordless cry of frustration and rage. And then the king was wheeling his horse, trying to rally his men, trying to form them into some kind of defensive formation. But it was too late. The enemy cavalry charged. Chapter 3. The Silver Knight in the Storm. The collision of the two cavalry forces was like the meeting of two waves, each trying to overwhelm the other through sheer mass and violence. The sound was indescribable, a cacophony of screaming horses, shouting men, the crash of lance on shield, the ring of sword on sword, the wet, meaty sounds of weapons finding flesh. The good knight found himself in the heart of the melee, surrounded by a swirling chaos of friend and foe, unable to distinguish one from the other in the press of bodies. His horse was jostled from all sides, barely able to move. A lance point thrust at his chest. He deflected it with his shield, felt the impact jar his arm to the shoulder. He cut at the lancer, his sword biting into the man's arm, and the lance fell away. A mace swung at his head from the right. He ducked, felt the wind of its passage, came up with a thrust that caught his attacker in the throat, just above the rim of his mail coif. Blood sprayed, hot and copper-smelling, spattering the good knight's face and armor. His horse went down. He felt it happening, the animal's legs buckling, a scream of pain and terror, and he kicked free of the stirrups, throwing himself clear as the horse collapsed. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs, and for a moment he lay stunned, unable to move, unable to think. A hoof came down inches from his head, the iron shoe striking sparks from a stone. He rolled, came up on one knee, his sword still somehow in his hand. A riderless horse galloped past, its eyes rolling white with panic. A man, Aragonese by his surcoat, staggered past with an arrow in his belly, his hands clutching at the shaft, his face grey with shock. The good knight forced himself to his feet. Without a horse, he was at a severe disadvantage. The cavalry battle was swirling around him, and he was in danger of being trampled by friend or foe. He needed to get clear, to find defensible ground. He saw a cluster of Aragonese knights, dismounted like himself, forming a rough circle with their backs together, their shields overlapping. It was the classic infantry defense against cavalry, the shield wall, the hedgehog formation. He ran toward them, his armor weighing him down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. An enemy horseman saw him, turned to ride him down. The good knight waited until the last moment, then threw himself to the side, rolling under the horse's belly. He came up behind the rider, grabbed the man's leg, and pulled him from the saddle. The man hit the ground with a crash of armor, and the good knight's sword found the gap between helmet and mail coif, ending the fight before it could begin. He reached the shield wall, and the Aragonese knights opened their formation just enough to let him in, then closed ranks again. There were perhaps 20 men in the circle, all of them dismounted, all of them bloodied. The good knight recognized some of them. Garcia, the young knight who had been riding near him earlier, his face now spattered with blood that might have been his own, or someone else's. A grizzled veteran named Sancho, his shield arm hanging useless at his side, broken by a mace blow. And there, in the center of the formation, King Sancho Ramírez himself, his surcoat torn, his helmet dented, but his eyes still fierce and defiant. "Hold the line!" the king was shouting. "Hold, damn you! Make them pay for every inch!" The enemy cavalry circled the shield wall like wolves around a wounded stag, looking for an opening. Occasionally one would charge in, trying to break the formation, but the overlapping shields and the thicket of spears held them at bay. It was a stalemate, but a temporary one. The Aragonese were outnumbered, surrounded, cut off from any hope of reinforcement or escape. It was only a matter of time before the enemy infantry reformed and came in to finish them off. The good knight's mind raced, looking for a way out, a strategy that might save at least some of these men. But he could see none. They were trapped, pure and simple. The terrain that had made this such perfect ambush ground now made escape impossible. The heights were too steep to climb under fire. The road ahead was blocked by enemy cavalry. The road behind was blocked by enemy infantry and the jinetes who were still harrying the remnants of the Aragonese column. He thought of Fortune, the young knight who had been so eager for glory. He didn't see him in the shield wall. He hoped the boy had survived, had somehow escaped, but he doubted it. The first battle was always the hardest. Most men didn't survive it. An arrow struck the shield of the man next to the good knight, the point punching through and drawing blood from the man's forearm. The man cursed, but held his position. Another arrow, and another. The archers on the heights had found their range again, and they were methodically shooting into the packed formation where every arrow was almost guaranteed to find a target. "We can't stay here," the good knight said to King Sancho. "They'll shoot us to pieces." "I know," the king replied, his voice tight. "But where can we go?" Before the good knight could answer, a new sound cut through the chaos of battle. A horn, deep and resonant, blowing 3 long notes. It was a signal, though the good knight didn't know what it meant. The enemy cavalry began to pull back, disengaging from the shield wall. For a moment, the good knight dared to hope that they were retreating, that the Zaragozan commander had decided the cost of finishing off the Aragonese was too high. But then he saw what was really happening, and his hope died. The infantry was advancing, not the disorganized rabble that had formed the initial blocking force, but a fresh formation, several hundred strong, moving with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers. They were formed in a deep column, shields locked, spears bristling. At their head, mounted on a white horse and wearing armor that gleamed even in the grey winter light, was a figure that the good knight recognized even at a distance. Rodrigo Diaz de Viva, El Cid, the champion. The good knight had never met the man, but he knew him by reputation. Everyone in Christian Spain knew the Cid, the greatest warrior of the age, a man whose skill with sword and lance was legendary, whose tactical genius had won battles against impossible odds. He had been the right hand of King Alfonso VI, the terror of the Taifas, until some political intrigue, the details of which varied depending on who was telling the story, had led to his eggs. Now he fought for Zaragoza, and he had come to finish what his men had started. The Cid raised his sword, a gesture that was both salute and challenge, and then he spurred his horse forward. The infantry column followed, moving at a steady, inexorable pace. "Brace!" King Sancho shouted. "Brace for impact!" The Aragonese knights locked their shields, planted their feet, and waited. There was nothing else they could do. They were going to die here, on this frozen road, on Christmas Day, far from home. But they would die as warriors, standing and fighting, not running and begging for mercy. The good knight felt a strange calm settle over him. He had been in this position before, surrounded, outnumbered, facing certain death. He had always survived before, though he didn't know why, didn't understand the mechanism that kept him alive when other men died. Perhaps today would be different. Perhaps today, the long, strange journey that had carried him through centuries would finally end. He found that he didn't mind the thought as much as he might have expected. The enemy infantry was 50 yards away, 40, 30, and then Impossibly, the attack stopped. The Cid raised his hand, and the infantry column halted. The good knight could see the CID's face now, could see the calculating intelligence in his eyes as he studied the Aragonese shield wall. The Cid was not a man who wasted his soldiers' lives unnecessarily. He could see that the Aragonese were beaten, that they had nowhere to go. There was no need for a final, costly assault. The Cid walked his horse forward, alone, until he was perhaps 20 feet from the shield wall. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, pitched to carry. "King Sancho Ramírez of Aragon, I am Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, in the service of King Al-Muhtaman of Zaragoza. You are defeated. Your army is scattered. Your campaign has failed. I offer you terms." There was a long silence. Then King Sancho stepped forward, out of the shield wall, his sword still in his hand but lowered, not threatening. "What terms?" "The King asked. "You and your knights may withdraw," the Cid said. "You will leave your wounded. You will leave your supplies. You will leave the fortress of Naval, which you will evacuate within 3 days. In exchange, I will allow you to return to your kingdom with your lives and your honor intact." It was a generous offer, far more generous than the Aragonese had any right to expect. The Cid could have demanded ransoms, could have taken prisoners, could have slaughtered them all and left their bodies for the crows. Instead, he was offering them a way out. But the price was high. Naval was the key to the entire campaign, the strategic linchpin that controlled the Cinca Valley. To give it up was to surrender all the gains of the past year, to admit that the Aragonese offensive had been a failure. King Sancho's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, pride warring with pragmatism, honor warring with survival. The good knight could see the struggle playing out behind the king's eyes. Finally, King Sancho spoke. "I accept your terms." The Cid nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. "Then go, and do not return to this valley. The next time we meet, I will not be so merciful." He turned his horse and rode back to his lines. The infantry column parted to let him through, then reformed, standing at attention, a silent reminder of the force that could have crushed the Aragonese if the Cid had chosen to unleash it. King Sancho turned back to his men. His face was grey, aged 10 years in the span of an hour. "We're leaving," he said quietly. "Gather the wounded who can walk. Leave the rest. We march for Naval." The shield wall dissolved, the knights lowering their weapons, their shoulders slumping with exhaustion and relief and shame. They had survived, but at a cost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The good knight sheathed his sword and began to walk. His horse was dead, his armor was dented and scratched, and he was bleeding from a dozen minor wounds that he hadn't even noticed receiving. But he was alive. He was always alive. Chapter 4. The Long Retreat. The march back to Naval was a nightmare of cold and pain and humiliation. The Aragonese column, what was left of it, straggled along the road in a loose, disorganized mass. There was no formation now, no military discipline, just a collection of exhausted, defeated men trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the killing ground at Piedra Pisada. The good knight walked near the rear of the column, helping to support a wounded knight whose leg had been broken by a mace blow. The man's name was Íñigo, and he was delirious with pain, mumbling prayers and curses in equal measure. Every step was agony for him, but he refused to be left behind, refused to become one of the men lying in the mud waiting for the Zaragozan soldiers to come and finish them off or take them prisoner. The sun was setting now, the grey overcast breaking up to reveal a sky streaked with red and gold. It should have been beautiful, but the good knight found no beauty in it. All he could see was the blood-red light reflecting off the snow on the distant peaks, a reminder of the blood that had been spilled today. They reached Naval as full darkness fell. The town was in chaos, the garrison having heard rumors of the battle and preparing for a siege. When they saw King Sancho and the remnants of his army staggering through the gates, the mood shifted from fear to despair. The good knight helped Inigo to the church, where the wounded were being gathered. The priest and a handful of women were doing what they could. Washing wounds, setting broken bones, administering what little medicine they had. But there were too many wounded, and too few hands to help them. Men lay on the stone floor of the church, groaning and crying out, their blood pooling on the ancient flagstones. The good knight found a corner and sat down, his back against the cold stone wall. He was so tired he could barely think, his body a mass of aches and pains. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and when he opened them again, it was dawn. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. King Sancho, true to his word, ordered the evacuation of Naval. Everything that could be carried was loaded onto wagons. Food, weapons, tools, anything of value. What couldn't be carried was destroyed, to keep it from falling into enemy hands. The townspeople were given a choice: come with the Aragonese army back to the north, or stay and take their chances under Zaragozan rule. Most chose to leave. They had no love for the Muslims, and they feared reprisals for having cooperated with the Christian occupation. On the 3rd day, the column set out again, this time heading north toward the safety of the high mountains. The good knight walked with them, leading a mule loaded with supplies. He had found the animal wandering loose after the battle, its owner presumably dead. As they passed through the gates of Naval for the last time, the good knight looked back at the town. It sat on its promontory, its walls solid and strong, its position commanding the valley. It had been a symbol of Aragonese power, proof that the Christian kingdoms were advancing, that the Reconquista was succeeding. Now it was being abandoned, returned to Muslim control, a symbol instead of Christian failure. The march north took a week. The weather turned bitter, with snow falling almost every day. Men died on the road, some from their wounds, some from cold and exhaustion. They were buried in shallow graves beside the road, marked with crude wooden crosses that would be gone by spring. The good knight survived, as he always did. He helped where he could, carrying supplies, tending the wounded, standing watch at night when the column made camp. He spoke little, and when he did speak, it was to offer practical advice or quiet encouragement. The other men began to regard him with a kind of superstitious awe. He had been in the thick of the fighting at Piedra Pisada, had been seen cutting down enemy soldiers with a skill that seemed almost supernatural, and yet he had emerged with barely a scratch. Some whispered that he was blessed by God, that he was a saint in disguise. Others whispered darker things, that he had made a pact with the devil, that he was not truly human at all. The good knight ignored the whispers. He had heard them all before, in other armies, other times. Let them think what they wanted. It didn't matter. They reached Jaca on the 1st day of the new year, 1085. The city was decked out for the feast of the circumcision, with banners and garlands decorating the streets. But the festive mood evaporated when the people saw the state of the returning army. This was not a victorious force returning from a successful campaign. This was a beaten, broken remnant, limping home in defeat. King Sancho Ramírez rode through the streets with his head held high, refusing to show weakness, but the good knight could see the toll the defeat had taken on him. The king had aged, his face lined with new wrinkles, his eyes haunted. The army was disbanded, the knights returning to their estates, the infantry to their villages. The good knight found himself standing in the main square of Jaca, watching the men disperse, wondering what he should do next. He had no home to return to. He had no family, no lord, no ties to bind him to any particular place. He was a wanderer, a ghost, moving through history but never truly part of it. A voice spoke behind him. "You fought well at Piedra Pisada." The good knight turned to find King Sancho standing there, alone, without his usual retinue of guards and advisors. The king looked tired, older than his years. "I survived," the good knight said. "That's not the same as fighting well." "You kept your head when other men panicked," the king said. "You helped form the shield wall that saved my life and the lives of my knights. That's more than most men could have done." The good knight said nothing. He didn't know how to respond to praise. It made him uncomfortable, made him feel like a fraud. He hadn't done anything special. He had simply done what needed to be done, what his centuries of experience had taught him to do. "I'm going to try again," King Sancho said quietly. "Not this year, maybe not next year, but I will return to the Cinca Valley. I will take Naval and Barbastro and eventually Zaragoza itself. This defeat, it's a setback, nothing more. You may not live to see it," the good knight said bluntly. "War is unpredictable. Kings die in battle, or from disease, or from a stray arrow that finds the gap in their armor. You can't know what the future holds." "No," King Sancho agreed. "But I can try. That's all any of us can do. Try and hope, and fight for what we believe in." He held out his hand. The good knight looked at it for a moment, then clasped it. The king's grip was firm, his palm calloused from years of holding sword and lance. "Will you fight with me again?" King Sancho asked. "When I return to the south?" The good knight thought about it. He thought about the blood and the chaos and the screaming horses. He thought about young Fortune, who had been so eager for glory and who was now probably lying dead in a ravine near Piedra Pisada. He thought about all the battles he had fought, all the wars he had seen, all the kingdoms that had risen and fallen while he endured. "Perhaps," he said finally, "if I'm still here." King Sancho nodded, as if that was answer enough. He released the good knight's hand and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The good knight stood alone in the square, watching the people of Jaca go about their lives, oblivious to the defeat that had been suffered in the mountains to the south. Life went on. It always did. Kingdoms rose and fell, battles were won and lost, men lived and died, but the world kept turning. He thought about Naval, sitting empty now, waiting for the Zaragozan garrison to arrive and reclaim it. He thought about the Cid, that brilliant, ruthless warrior who had defeated 2 Christian kings in a single year. He thought about the long, slow grind of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle that would continue long after everyone alive today was dust. And he thought about himself, the silver-armored knight who never died, who walked through history like a ghost, witnessing, but never truly participating, surviving, but never truly living. He didn't know why he was cursed or blessed with this strange immortality. He didn't know what purpose it served, what lesson he was supposed to learn. All he knew was that he would continue, as he always had, moving from battle to battle, from war to war, until... what? Until he finally found the death that had eluded him for so long? Until he discovered the reason for his existence? He didn't know. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the not knowing was the lesson itself. The good knight pulled his cloak tighter against the cold and began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, didn't have a destination in mind. But that was nothing new. He had been walking for centuries, and he would walk for centuries more. The Battle of Piedra Pisada was over. The war continued. And the good knight walked on. Chapter 5. The Weight of Memory. 3 days after the army's return to Jaca, the good knight found himself in a tavern near the city's eastern gate, nursing a cup of wine that had gone sour and listening to the conversation swirling around him. The tavern was crowded with soldiers from the campaign, men trying to drown their memories in alcohol and companionship. They spoke in low voices, reliving the battle, arguing about what had gone wrong, assigning blame. Some blamed the scouts for not detecting the ambush. Others blamed the king for pressing forward when caution would have been wiser. A few blamed God himself, wondering why the Almighty had allowed Christian warriors to be defeated on the holiest day of the year. The good knight listened, but did not participate. He had learned long ago that there was no profit in such discussions. Battles were lost for 1,000 reasons, most of them invisible to the men who fought them. Terrain, weather, luck, the competence of commanders, the morale of troops, the quality of intelligence, all of these factors and more combined in ways that were impossible to predict or control. The Battle of Piedra Pisada had been lost because the Zaragozan commander, whether it was the Cid himself or one of his lieutenants, had understood the terrain better than the Aragonese, had positioned his forces more skillfully, and had executed his plan with precision and discipline. It was as simple and as complicated as that. A young man sat down across from the good knight, uninvited. It took the good knight a moment to recognize him. It was Garcia, the knight who had been riding near him before the battle, who had spoken so confidently about the cowardice of the Moors. He looked different now. The confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed exhaustion. "You were right," Garcia said without preamble. "About battle. About what it's really like." The good knight said nothing, waiting. "I thought I was ready," Garcia continued. "I thought I understood what I was getting into, but I didn't. I couldn't have. No one can, until they've been through it." "And now you have," the good knight said. "Now I have." Garcia took a long drink from his own cup, his hands shaking slightly. "I killed a man. Maybe more than one. It's hard to remember. It all happened so fast. I saw Fortune die. Did you know that? Did you see it?" The good knight shook his head. "I didn't see it, but I assumed. A javelin," Garcia said. "Right through the throat. He was trying to rally some of the infantry, trying to get them to form a line, and a javelin came out of nowhere and just ended him. He didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was alive, shouting orders, and the next he was on the ground, drowning in his own blood." The good knight had seen that death 1,000 times, in 1,000 variations. It was one of the most common ways for a warrior to die. A missile from an unseen enemy, striking without warning, killing before the victim even knew he was in danger. "He wanted glory," Garcia said bitterly. "He wanted to be a hero, to have songs sung about him. Instead, he died in the mud, and no one will remember his name." "You remember it," the good knight pointed out. "For now. But in 10 years, 20, I'll be dead too, probably. And then who will remember Fortune of Anso? Who will remember any of us?" It was a question the good knight had asked himself many times over the centuries. He remembered names and faces that had been forgotten by history, warriors who had fought and died in battles that no chronicle recorded, in wars that no one remembered. He carried their memories with him, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. "Memory is all we have," the good knight said quietly. "It's what separates us from the animals. We remember, we tell stories, we pass on the lessons we've learned, so that those who come after us might not have to learn them the hard way." "But what's the point?" Garcia asked. "If we all die anyway, if we're all forgotten anyway, what's the point of any of it?" The good knight didn't have a good answer to that. It was the fundamental question, the one that had haunted philosophers and theologians for millennia. Why do we exist? What is the purpose of life if life inevitably ends in death? The point, the good knight said slowly, choosing his words carefully, is that we were here. We lived. We fought. We loved and hated and feared and hoped. We were part of the great tapestry of history, even if our individual threads are too small to see. That has to be enough, because it's all we get. I'm leaving, Garcia said. I'm going back to my father's estate, and I'm never picking up a sword again. Let other men fight the Moors. Let other men chase glory and honor. I've had enough. That's your choice to make, the good knight said. No one can fault you for it. Garcia stood, swaying slightly. Whether from drink or exhaustion, the good knight couldn't tell. What about you? What will you do? The good knight looked down at his cup, at the dark wine that reflected the lamplight like a pool of blood. I'll do what I always do. I'll keep walking. I'll find another war, another battle. It's all I know how to do. That's a sad way to live, Garcia said. Yes, the good knight agreed. It is. Garcia left, disappearing into the crowd. The good knight sat alone, finishing his wine, listening to the voices around him gradually fade as the night grew late and the soldiers drifted away to their beds. Eventually, he was the only one left in the tavern, except for the innkeeper who was cleaning tables and giving the good knight pointed looks, clearly wanting to close up for the night. The good knight stood, left a few coins on the table, and walked out into the cold night air. The streets of Jaca were empty, the city asleep. Above, the stars were brilliant in the clear winter sky, the same stars that had looked down on countless battles, countless wars, countless generations of men who had lived and died and been forgotten. The good knight walked through the streets, his footsteps echoing off the stone buildings. He didn't know where he was going, didn't have a destination in mind. He was just walking, as he had been walking for centuries, as he would continue to walk for centuries more. He thought about King Sancho's promise to return to the Cinca Valley, to try again to conquer the lands held by Zaragoza. The king would try, and he might even succeed. Though history, the good knight knew, would record that Sancho Ramírez would die in 1094, killed during the faltered siege of Huesca, never having achieved his dream of conquering Zaragoza. But that was 10 years in the future. For now the king was alive, and he was planning, and he was hoping. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the trying was more important than the succeeding. The good knight reached the city walls and climbed the stairs to the battlements. From here he could see out over the dark landscape, the mountains rising like black waves against the star-filled sky. Somewhere to the south, beyond those mountains, lay the Cinca Valley and the fortress of Naval, now back in Muslim hands. Somewhere out there, the Cid was probably planning his next move, consolidating his victories, preparing for the next phase of the endless war. The good knight wondered if he would face the Cid again someday. He hoped so. There was something about the man, a quality of excellence, of mastery, that commanded respect even from an enemy. The Cid was what all warriors aspired to be, skilled, intelligent, honorable in his own way, and utterly dedicated to his craft. But that was a question for the future. For now, the good knight was here, in Jaca, on a cold winter night, watching the stars and thinking about the battle he had survived, and the men who had not. He thought about Fortune, dying with a javelin in his throat, his dreams of glory unfulfilled. He thought about Inigo, the wounded knight he had helped to Naval, who had died 2 days later from infection, his broken leg turning black and putrid despite the priest's best efforts. He thought about all the nameless soldiers who had fallen at Piedra Pisada, whose bodies still lay in the ravines and on the roadside, food for crows and wolves. He thought about the weight of memory, the burden of being the one who survived, who remembered, who carried the stories of the dead forward into the future. It was a heavy burden, but it was his burden, and he would carry it, as he had always carried it, until the day came when he could finally lay it down. If that day ever came. The good knight stood on the battlements until dawn, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to grey to pale blue. When the sun finally rose, painting the snow-capped peaks with gold and rose, he descended from the walls and walked back into the city. There was work to be done. There were always wounded to tend, supplies to organize, preparations to make for the next campaign. The war would continue, with or without him. But while he was here, while he still drew breath, he would do what he could. It was all anyone could do. Chapter 6. The Lessons of Piedra Pisada. Spring came late to the Pyrenees in 1085. The snows lingered in the high passes well into April, and the roads remained muddy and treacherous long after they should have dried. The good knight spent those months in Jaca, helping with the reconstruction of the army, training new recruits and trying to prepare them for the realities of war. It was frustrating work. The young men who came to join the king's forces were full of the same naive enthusiasm that Fortune had displayed, the same unshakable belief that they were destined for glory. The good knight tried to temper that enthusiasm with realism, tried to teach them that survival was more important than heroism, that a living coward was more valuable than a dead hero. Some of them listened. Most did not. King Sancho Ramírez did not launch another campaign that year. The defeat at Piedra Pisada had been too costly, both in terms of men and morale. The king needed time to rebuild, to replenish his forces, to restore confidence in his leadership. Instead, the king turned his attention to other matters. He strengthened the defenses of his existing holdings, built new castles to guard the mountain passes, and negotiated alliances with other Christian kingdoms. He was playing the long game now, understanding that the conquest of Zaragoza would not be achieved in a single campaign or even a single decade. The good knight watched these preparations with a mixture of approval and sadness. Approval because the king was learning from his mistakes, was becoming a wiser and more cautious commander. Sadness because the good knight knew that all of this effort, all of this planning, would ultimately be for nothing. King Sancho would die at Huesca in 1094, and it would be left to his son, Peter, and his grandson, Alfonso the Battler, to finally conquer Zaragoza in 1118, 34 years after the disaster at Piedra Pisada. But the good knight said nothing. He had learned long ago not to speak of the future, not to reveal the knowledge that his long life had given him. Men did not react well to prophecy, especially when it was prophecy of failure and death. In May, news reached Jaca that Alfonso VI of Leon had captured Toledo. The ancient Visigothic capital, the symbolic heart of Christian Spain, had fallen after a long siege. It was a triumph that eclipsed all of Alfonso's previous victories, a triumph that would secure his place in history as one of the great kings of the Reconquista. The news was bittersweet for the Aragonese. On one hand, it was a victory for Christendom, proof that the Muslim kingdoms could be defeated, that the Reconquista was not just a dream, but an achievable goal. On the other hand, it highlighted Aragon's own failure. While Alfonso VI was conquering cities, Sancho Ramírez had been forced to retreat from a single fortress. The good knight understood the politics of the situation. Alfonso and Sancho were rivals as much as they were allies, both competing for territory, for prestige, for the title of the greatest Christian king in Iberia. The fall of Toledo shifted the balance of power decisively in Alfonso's favor. But the good knight also understood that the fall of Toledo would have consequences that went far beyond the immediate political situation. The Muslim Taifa kings, terrified by Alfonso's success, would soon invite the Almoravids, the fierce Berber warriors from North Africa, to come to their aid. And the Almoravids would come, and they would defeat Alfonso at the Battle of Zaragoza in 1086, and the Reconquista would be set back by decades. But again, the good knight said nothing. History would unfold as it always did, regardless of what he knew or didn't know. In June, the good knight left Jaca. He had stayed longer than he usually did in any one place, and he felt the familiar restlessness that always came when he remained stationary for too long. He was a wanderer by nature, or by curse, and he needed to move, to see new places, to find new battles. He traveled south, avoiding the Tinca Valley and the lands controlled by Zaragoza. Instead, he headed west, toward the Kingdom of Leon, curious to see the aftermath of Alfonso's great victory at Toledo. The journey took several weeks. The good knight traveled alone, as he usually did, avoiding the main roads and the large towns where questions might be asked about his strange armor and his lack of a lord or a household. He slept under the stars, hunted for his food, and spoke to no one unless necessity demanded it. It was a lonely existence, but the good knight had grown accustomed to loneliness over the centuries. It was the price of immortality, the cost of outliving everyone he might have called a friend. As he traveled, he thought about the Battle of Piedra Pisada, analyzing it in his mind, trying to extract lessons that might be useful in future conflicts. The battle had been a masterclass in the use of terrain and timing. The Zaragozan commander, whether it was the Cid or someone else, had understood that the Aragonese heavy cavalry was most vulnerable when it was strung out on the march, unable to deploy into its devastating charge formation. He had chosen his ground carefully, selecting a location where the terrain would negate the Aragonese advantages and amplify their weaknesses. The use of multiple attack vectors, the archers on the heights, the infantry blocking the road, the cavalry striking from the rear, had created a situation where the Aragonese had no good options. Every direction they turned, they faced a new threat. It was a classic example of what later military theorists would call interior lines, though the good knight didn't know that term. He just knew that it had been effective. The decision to offer terms rather than annihilate the trapped Aragonese had been equally brilliant. It had saved Zaragozan lives, had avoided the risk of a desperate last stand that might have inflicted heavy casualties, and had achieved the strategic objective, the recovery of Naval, without the need for a costly siege. It was the kind of decision that separated great commanders from merely good ones. A lesser commander would have pressed the attack, would have sought total victory, would have let pride and bloodlust override strategic calculation. The CID, if it had indeed been the Cid, had been wiser than that. The good knight wondered if he would ever achieve that level of mastery. He had been fighting for centuries, had accumulated more battlefield experience than any man al-Siatsam, but he still felt like he was learning, still felt like there were lessons he had yet to grasp. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the learning never ended. Perhaps wisdom was not a destination, but a journey, and the moment you thought you had arrived was the moment you stopped growing. These were the thoughts that occupied the good knight as he traveled west through the mountains and valleys of northern Spain toward whatever future awaited him. Chapter 7. The Eternal March. By the time the good knight reached the borders of Leon, summer had arrived in full. The landscape had transformed from the grey and white of winter to the green and gold of the growing season. Fields of wheat and barley rippled in the breeze. Vineyards heavy with ripening grapes climbed the hillsides, and the air was thick with the scent of wild flowers and warm earth. It was beautiful, and the good knight allowed himself a moment to appreciate it. Beauty was rare in his life, and he had learned to treasure it when he found it. He passed through villages where the people were celebrating the fall of Toledo, where priests gave sermons about the triumph of the cross over the crescent, where children played at being knights and Moors, reenacting battles they had never seen and could not truly understand. The good knight did not stop in these villages. He had nothing to say to these people, no wisdom to share, no stories they would want to hear. They were living in a moment of triumph, and he would not darken that moment with tales of defeat and death. He continued west, following the old Roman roads, until he reached the city of Leon itself. The city was bustling with activity, filled with soldiers and merchants and pilgrims, all drawn by the magnetism of Alfonso VI's court. The king was not in residence. He was in Toledo, consolidating his conquest. But his presence was felt everywhere, in the banners that flew from the castle walls, in the prosperity that flowed from his victories, in the confidence and pride of his subjects. The good knight spent a few days in Leon, listening to the talk in the taverns and markets, gathering information about the state of the kingdom and the plans for future campaigns. He learned that Alfonso was already looking beyond Toledo, already planning new conquests, new expansions of Christian territory. He also learned that the Taifa kings were terrified, that they were sending desperate embassies to North Africa, begging the Almoravids to come to their aid. The good knight knew what that meant. He knew that the Almoravids would come, and that when they did, the nature of the war would change. The Taifas, for all their wealth and sophistication, were relatively weak militarily. The Almoravids were not. They were hardened desert warriors, fanatical in their faith, disciplined in their tactics, and utterly ruthless in their prosecution of war. The Reconquista was about to become much more difficult, but that was a problem for the future. For now, the good knight was in Leon, and he was restless, and he was looking for something, though he couldn't have said what. He found it, unexpectedly, in a small chapel on the outskirts of the city. The chapel was old, pre-Romanesque, its walls thick and its windows narrow. Inside, it was cool and dark, lit only by a few candles flickering before a wooden crucifix. The good knight entered, drawn by some impulse he didn't fully understand, and sat down on one of the rough wooden benches. He was not a religious man. He had seen too much, lived too long, to have faith in the benevolent God that the priests preached about. If God existed, he was either indifferent to human suffering or actively cruel, and the good knight wanted nothing to do with such a deity. But there was something about the silence of the chapel, the stillness, the sense of sanctuary that appealed to him. It was a place outside of time, outside of war, a place where he could simply be, without the weight of memory and duty pressing down on him. He sat there for a long time, his eyes closed, his mind empty. He didn't pray. He didn't think. He just existed, breathing in and out, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath him, hearing the distant sounds of the city muffled by the thick walls. Eventually, he became aware of another presence in the chapel. He opened his eyes to find an old priest standing nearby, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you well, my son?" the priest asked. His voice was gentle, his eyes kind. "I'm fine," the good knight said. "You've been sitting here for hours," the priest said. "I was worried you might be ill, or in some kind of distress." "Just tired," the good knight said. "I've been traveling for a long time." The priest nodded, as if that explained everything. "Where are you traveling to?" "I don't know," the good knight said honestly. "Wherever the road takes me, I suppose." The priest sat down on the bench beside him, his old bones creaking. "That's a hard way to live, with no destination, no home to return to. It's the only way I know, the good knight said. They sat in silence for a while. Then the priest spoke again. You're a warrior, aren't you? I can see it in the way you carry yourself, in the scars on your hands. I am, the good knight confirmed. Have you killed many men? Yes. Does it trouble you? The good knight considered the question. Did it trouble him? He had killed so many men over the centuries that they had ceased to be individual people in his memory and had become, instead, a faceless mass, a blur of violence and death. He remembered some of them, the first man he had ever killed, a Saxon warrior with red hair and a missing tooth, a Saracen knight at Jerusalem who had fought with such skill and courage that the good knight had felt genuine sorrow at having to kill him, a young French soldier at some forgotten battle whose last words had been a cry for his mother. But most of them were just gone, erased from his memory as if they had never existed. Sometimes, the good knight said finally, but not as much as it should, I think. I've become numb to it. Death is just part of the world I live in. It's no more remarkable than the sunrise or the rain. The priest was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, That's a terrible thing, to become numb to death. It means you've lost part of your humanity. Perhaps, the good knight said. Or perhaps it means I've simply lived too long. The priest looked at him sharply. What do you mean by that? The good knight realized he had said too much. He stood, preparing to leave. Nothing. Just the ramblings of a tired man. Thank you for your concern, Father, but I should be going. The priest stood as well, placing a hand on the good knight's arm. Wait. Before you go, let me give you a blessing. You may not believe in God, but perhaps God believes in you. The good knight wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away, but something in the old priest's eyes stopped him. There was a kindness there, a genuine concern for a stranger's well-being that touched something deep inside him, something he had thought long dead. All right, he said quietly. The priest placed both hands on the good knight's head and spoke in Latin, the ancient words of blessing that had been spoken over countless warriors throughout the centuries. The good knight didn't understand all of the words, but he understood the intent, a prayer for protection, for guidance, for peace. When the priest finished, he lowered his hands and smiled. Go with God, my son. And remember, no matter how far you wander, no matter how lost you feel, you are never truly alone. The good knight nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned and walked out of the chapel, back into the bright sunlight of the summer afternoon. He left Leon that same day, heading south toward the frontier, toward the lands where Christian and Muslim kingdoms met and clashed in an endless cycle of raid and counter-raid, siege and battle. He didn't know what he would find there. He didn't know what battles awaited him, what wars he would fight, what men he would kill or watch die. But he knew he would continue. He would keep walking, keep fighting, keep surviving, because that was what he did. That was all he knew how to do. The Battle of Piedra Pisada was behind him now, receding into memory, becoming just another entry in the long catalogue of battles he had witnessed and survived. In time, it would fade even further, becoming a dim recollection, a half-remembered story, until eventually it would be gone entirely, erased by the weight of new experiences, new battles, new deaths. But for now, he remembered. He remembered the cold of that Christmas day, the chaos of the ambush, the desperate fight in the shield wall. He remembered Fortun's eager face and Garcia's haunted eyes. He remembered King Sancho's pride and the Cid's mercy. He remembered the long, bitter retreat to Naval and the shame of abandoning the fortress they had fought so hard to win. He remembered, because that was his burden and his purpose. He was the witness, the one who survived, the one who carried the stories forward into the future. And so he walked on, his silver armor gleaming in the sun, his sword at his side, his face turned toward the horizon and whatever lay beyond it. The road stretched out before him, winding through the hills and valleys of Spain, leading toward battles yet to be fought, toward wars yet to be waged, toward a future that was both unknown and inevitable. The good knight walked that road, as he had walked countless roads before it, as he would walk countless roads after it. He walked alone, but he was not lonely. He carried with him the memories of all the men he had fought beside, all the battles he had survived, all the lessons he had learned, and in a strange way, that was enough. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the day grew warmer, and the good knight continued his eternal march through history, a silver-armored ghost moving through a world that would never truly be his home. Behind him, the Kingdom of Aragon licked its wounds and planned its next campaign. Ahead of him, the Taifa of Zaragoza celebrated its victory and prepared for the inevitable return of the Christian armies. And all around him, the great wheel of history turned, grinding kingdoms to dust and raising new ones from the ashes, indifferent to the hopes and dreams and sufferings of the individual men and women caught in its gears. The good knight had seen this cycle repeat itself countless times. He would see it countless times more. But for now, on this bright summer day in the year 1085, he was simply a traveller on a road, a warrior between wars, a man, if he could still be called a man, searching for something he could not name and might never find. He walked on, and the world turned, and the wars continued, and the good knight endured. Epilogue. The Echo of Piedra Pisada. 10 years later, in the autumn of 1094, the good knight found himself once again in the Kingdom of Aragon. He had wandered far in the intervening decade, to Castile and Leon, to the frontier lands of Extremadura, even briefly to the Christian kingdoms of the north, beyond the Pyrenees. He had fought in a dozen battles, large and small, had seen Alfonso VI's great victory at Toledo followed by his humiliating defeat at Sagrajas, had watched the Almoravids sweep across Al-Andalus like a desert storm, conquering the typhus they had come to save, and establishing a new, more militant Islamic power in Iberia. But now he was back in Aragon, drawn by news that King Sancho Ramírez was besieging the city of Huesca, the last major Muslim stronghold in the central Pyrenees. If Huesca fell, the entire upper Ebro Valley would be open to Christian conquest. It would be the victory that had eluded Sancho at Piedra Pisada, the triumph that would vindicate his decade of patient preparation. The good knight arrived at the siege lines in late October. The Aragonese army was encamped around the city, a sprawling collection of tents and siege engines and supply wagons. The siege had been going on for months, and the men were tired and frustrated. Huesca's walls were strong, its garrison determined, and the city showed no signs of surrendering. The good knight made his way through the camp, looking for familiar faces. He found a few, veterans of the Piedra Pisada campaign who had survived the intervening years. They greeted him with a mixture of surprise and respect, remembering the silver-armored knight who had fought so well in that long-ago battle. He also found King Sancho, now greyer and more careworn than he had been 10 years before, but still vigorous, still determined. The king recognized the good knight immediately. "You came back," Sancho said, a note of genuine pleasure in his voice. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again." "I heard you were besieging Huesca," the good knight said. "I thought you might need another sword." "I always need another sword," Sancho said with a tired smile, "especially one wielded by a man who knows how to use it. Will you fight with us?" "I will," the good knight said. And so he joined the siege, taking his place in the lines, participating in the assaults on the walls, the skirmishes with the garrison's sorties, the endless grinding work of siege warfare. It was during one of these assaults, on a cold November day, that disaster struck. The Aragonese had managed to breach a section of the wall, and King Sancho was leading a group of knights through the gap, trying to establish a foothold inside the city. The good knight was with him, fighting in the narrow streets, when a Muslim archer on a rooftop drew his bow and loosed. The arrow struck King Sancho in the belly, punching through his mail and burying itself deep in his flesh. The king went down with a cry of pain. The good knight and the other knights immediately formed a protective circle around him, fighting off the Muslim defenders while they dragged the king back through the breach and out of the city. They carried him to his tent, where the physicians examined the wound and shook their heads gravely. The arrow had penetrated deep, and the wound was already showing signs of infection. In an age before antibiotics, such wounds were almost always fatal. King Sancho Ramírez died. 3 days later, on November 4th, 1094, his dream of conquering Huesca unfulfilled. The good knight stood at the king's bedside as he died, along with Prince Peter and the other great lords of Aragon. Sancho's last words were a command to his son to continue the siege, to take Huesca, to finish what he had started. Peter, now King Peter I, swore that he would. After the funeral, the good knight prepared to leave. He had done what he came to do, had fought in the siege, had witnessed the death of a king. There was nothing more for him here. But before he could depart, King Peter sought him out. "My father spoke of you often," Peter said. "He said you were the bravest knight he had ever known, and the strangest. He said you fought at Piedra Pisada, that you helped save his life that day." "I did what I could," the good knight said. "He also said you told him he might not live to see Zaragoza conquered." Peter continued. "He was right about that, but I will see it. I swear it. I will take Huesca, and then I will take Zaragoza, and I will finish what my father started." The good knight looked at the young king, young by the standards of mortal men, though the good knight had seen so many kings come and go that they all seemed young to him, and he saw the same determination, the same pride, the same refusal to accept defeat that had characterized his father. "You will," the good knight said quietly. "But not you, your son, Alfonso. He will be the one to take Zaragoza in the year 1118. He will be called Alfonso the Battler, and he will be remembered as one of the greatest warriors of the age." Peter stared at him, his eyes wide. "How do you know this?" The good knight realized, too late, that he had said too much. He had broken his own rule, had spoken of the future, had revealed knowledge that no mortal man should possess. "I don't know," he said, trying to cover his mistake. "It's just a feeling, a hope." But Peter was not fooled. He continued to stare at the good knight, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. "Who are you?" he whispered. "What are you?" The good knight had no answer to that question. He had been asking it himself for centuries, and he still didn't know. "I'm just a knight," he said finally. "A knight who has lived too long and seen too much. That's all." He turned and walked away, leaving King Peter standing alone in the camp, staring after him with troubled eyes. The good knight left the siege of Huesca that same day. He walked south, toward the frontier, toward the endless war that raged along the border between Christian and Muslim Spain. As he walked, he thought about King Sancho, about the Battle of Piedra Pisada, about the long, patient decade of preparation that had ended with an arrow in the belly and a death far from home. He thought about the futility of it all, the way that men's dreams and ambitions were so often crushed by chance and circumstance, by a random arrow or a moment of bad luck. But he also thought about the persistence of those dreams, the way that they survived even when the men who dreamed them did not. King Sancho had died, but his son would continue his work, and his son's son would finish it, would conquer Zaragoza, would achieve the victory that had eluded his grandfather at Piedra Pisada. That had to mean something. It had to. The good knight walked on, his silver armor gleaming in the pale autumn sunlight, his shadow stretching long behind him. He had witnessed the Battle of Piedra Pisada, had survived it, had carried its memory forward through the years, and now he had witnessed the death of the king who had fought in that battle, had seen the torch passed to a new generation. And he would continue. He would keep walking, keep fighting, keep witnessing, until... when? Until the Reconquista was complete? Until the last Muslim kingdom fell and all of Iberia was Christian once more? Or would he continue even beyond that, moving on to new wars, new battles, new kingdoms rising and falling? He didn't know. He couldn't know. All he could do was walk and remember and endure. The road stretched out before him, winding through the hills of Aragon, leading toward an uncertain future. The good knight walked that road, as he had walked so many roads before, as he would walk so many roads after. He walked alone, but he carried with him the memories of Piedra Pisada, of King Sancho, of Fortune and Garcia and all the other men who had fought and died in that long-ago battle. He carried those memories like a sacred trust, a burden and a privilege, a reminder that even in defeat, even in death, men's lives had meaning, their struggles had purpose. And so he walked on, into the gathering dusk, into the unknown future, into the endless cycle of war and peace, death and life, defeat and victory. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.